he, G1, opened his eyes to a sky that was not his. Pink light bled across the horizon like watercolor on wet paper. He was lying on stone, cold stone. His back ached, and his fingers scraped against rough granite as he pushed himself upright. 9 square meters. That was all there was. A flat slab of rock floating in white mist with nothing below and nothing around except the faint outlines of distant lands glimpsed through the haze. To the north, a dark pine forest stretched to the edge of sight. To the west, a wide river curved between wooden mills. Somewhere south, terraced vineyards climbed a hillside in neat green rows, all of it impossibly far away, all of it belonging to someone else. He had a straw mattress on a narrow cot, an iron-bound chest, a copper post hammered into the center of the stone with a seal shaped like a house carved into its face. That was everything. He sat on the edge of the slab and let his legs hang into the void. The mist swirled beneath his feet. He stayed like that for a long time. Then he rubbed his face with both palms and exhaled. 9 square meters. Southeast exposure, solid rock substrate, no water source, no wind corridor, no neighbors. He had worked with worse, almost. He stood up and opened the chest. Inside lay a rolled scroll tied with a leather cord, a dull knife with a wooden handle, 3 copper coins stacked neatly, and a small clay pot no bigger than his fist with a single seed resting at the bottom. He held the seed up against the pink light and turned it between his fingers. Something in his chest loosened. He almost smiled. So there was something to plant. He unrolled the scroll and read it, standing because there was no table and no chair. The words were not in any language he knew, and yet he understood them perfectly. The Trial of Lords. Every 100 years, the Heavenly Court distributes founding seals to young men of noble blood and to chosen commoners. Each seal binds a plot of land to the holder's soul. The holder has 5 years to build a thriving domain, or the seal fades, and the holder becomes a servant to a stronger lord. Marriage strengthens the seal. Each wife brings her own biome. The land shapes itself to the union. He read it twice, then a third time. He set the scroll down on the cot and looked at his slab of rock again. Other lords out there had forests, rivers, gold mines, farmland, the size of provinces. He had 9 square meters of granite and a single seed. He picked up the knife. It was barely sharp enough to cut bread. He knelt and began scratching lines into the stone. A grid. 45 centimeters per square. Where the cot stood, he marked with a small cross. Where the copper post rose, he drew a circle. The remaining space, he divided into zones. Sleeping area, storage, future cooking spot, future entrance if there ever was anything to enter from. He worked for an hour. The pink sky shifted to pale gold. By the time he finished, the entire surface of the slab was covered in thin white scratches forming a precise layout of a living space that did not yet exist. A planner plans, even on 9 square meters. He planted the seed in the clay pot using a pinch of pellwhite dust. He scraped from a crack in the stone. He set the pot in the southeast corner where the morning light would hit it first and stay longest. Then he sat on the cot and stared at the distant lands again. The forest lord to the north already had smoke rising from a chimney. The river lord to the west had boats moving on the water. They had started with everything. He had started with a rock. 3 days passed. He rationed his water from a thin condensation he collected each morning by laying the empty scroll flat against the cold stone. The mist settled on it overnight, and by dawn he could wring enough moisture into the clay pot to keep the seed alive and wet his own lips. He ate nothing. There was nothing to eat. He spent the days studying the land around him from the edge of the slab. The way the light moved told him which direction was true south. The way the mist thinned in the afternoon told him there was warmer air rising from somewhere below and to the east. The way the wind never blew told him the slab sat in a dead zone between 2 pressure systems. He noted all of it. He scratched angles and arrows into the stone next to his grid. On the morning of the 3rd day, he heard footsteps. That should have been impossible. There was nothing to walk on. But the sound was real. Soft leather on stone. He turned and saw a girl climbing the last step of a narrow rock bridge that had not been there the night before. She was young, 22 at most, dark hair falling loose past her shoulders. She wore a faded traveling robe the color of sand, and she carried nothing except a thin chain around her neck with a small amber pendant. Her eyes were red. She had been crying for a long time. She stopped at the edge of his slab and looked at him. He looked back. Yeah, she said that she had nowhere else to go. He said nothing for a moment. Then he asked her to sit down. She sat on the edge of the stone next to him and told him her story in a voice that kept breaking. Her name was Kim Soa. Her mother had been from a desert clan in the southern reaches. Her father had been the youngest son of a forest lord in the central woodlands. And the marriage had been political and loveless. And when her mother died, the forest clan wanted nothing to do with the daughter who carried desert blood. Her biome was sand, hot golden dunes that radiated heat and swallowed water. Every family she approached told her the same thing. Your land burns everything it touches. You will ruin us. She had been walking for 11 days. Juan listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he asked her 3 questions. Where were you born? What do you dream about? Was there a tree near your mother's house? So stared at him. So nobody had ever asked her those things. She answered slowly. She was born in a clay house at the edge of a dune sea. She dreamed of water. There had been a date palm outside her mother's window, and she used to fall asleep listening to its leaves. Juan picked up his knife. He began drawing on the stone. Her desert would go here on the south side. Between the desert and the rest of the domain, he scratched 3 lines. First, a gravel strip to break the heat. Then a band of tough dry grass to hold the boundary. Then a row of date palms planted deep. The palms would drink from far below the surface, and their roots would lock the sand in place. The dunes would not spread past the grove. And inside the desert itself, he marked a small circle, an oasis, not in the center, but shifted to the east, because the shadows from her rock formations would fall there in the afternoon and shade the water from evaporation. She could sleep beside the water, like when she was a child. Looked at the scratched lines on the stone for a long time. Then she reached up and unclasped the amber pendant from her neck. She placed it on the stone beside the copper post. The slab trembled. A deep hum rose from somewhere below. And to the south, the mist tore apart and golden sand poured into existence like a wave breaking in slow motion. Dunes rolled outward one after another. Heat shimmered above them, and there at the eastern edge, just where his knife had pointed, water surfaced. A small clear pool surrounded by 3 young date palms, already swaying in a warm breeze that had not existed a minute ago. Soe covered her mouth with both hands. Then she laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in a year. The sand was real. Jiwan stood at the southern edge of his slab and felt the heat rising from the dunes in slow waves. The air tasted different here, dry and mineral and old. He stepped off the stone onto sand for the first time, and his bare foot sank 2 inches, warm, not burning. He walked south toward the oasis. The 3 date palms stood exactly where he had drawn them. Their trunks were thin and young, but already rooted deep enough to hold firm against the wind that now moved steadily across the dune field. The pool was clear and still. He knelt beside it and cupped water in his hands. It was cool, slightly sweet. He drank until his stomach cramped. He had not had a real drink in 3 days, so A sat at the edge of the oasis with her knees pulled to her chest. She watched him drink and said nothing. Her face was calm for the first time since she had arrived. He wiped his mouth and looked around. The desert stretched roughly 300 meters in every direction from the slab. Beyond that, the mist closed in again. The gravel strip he had planned was already forming naturally where sand met stone. The tough grass was not there yet. The date palms were only 3. He needed more. He needed dozens to hold the border properly. But this was a start. He walked the entire perimeter that first day. So A followed at a distance. She was not used to someone walking her land without flinching. Every few hundred steps, Jifun stopped and crouched to press his palm flat against the sand. Temperature, moisture depth, grain size. He counted his paces and estimated distances. By evening, he had a rough map scratched onto a flat rock near the oasis. The desert was shaped like an uneven oval tilted northeast to southwest. The highest dunes clustered in the west, where the sand was oldest and most compacted. The eastern side was lower and softer, with occasional patches of dark mineral soil showing through. That was where things could grow. He marked those patches with small stones. So Ea asked him what the stones meant. He told her those were her fields. She looked at the barren sand and looked back at him. He explained that desert soil was not empty. It was full of minerals that washed out of deeper rock over centuries. In his old world, he had worked on a project in a place where nothing grew for 50 years, and they turned it green in 18 months by understanding what was already in the ground. The minerals were here. The water was here. What was missing was structure. Shade in the right places. Wind breaks at the right angles. Channels to move water from the oasis to the planting patches without losing it to evaporation. She asked if he was a sorcerer. He said he was something worse. He was an architect. Over the next 4 days they worked. Jiwon used his knife to cut channels in the sand, shallow grooves no wider than his forearm running from the oasis eastward to the dark soil patches. He angled them with a slight curve so that wind would not dry them out in a straight line. At the end of each channel, he dug a small basin the size of a washbowl and lined it with flat stones from the slab. So Asa carried water in the clay pot, back and forth, 20 trips a day. She did not complain once. On the 5th day, the seed in the clay pot sprouted. Jiwon almost missed it. He was kneeling at the easternmost channel, adjusting the depth of a basin, when Soa called out to him. He walked back to the slab, and there it was, a thin green shoot no taller than his little finger rising from the dark soil in the pot. He did not know what it was. The scroll had not said, but it was alive and it was green, and that meant chlorophyll and photosynthesis and the basic machinery of growth that worked the same in any world. He moved the pot to the first basin at the end of the nearest channel. The shoot would get water now without him carrying it. That freed his hands for other work. By the end of the first week, he had 6 channels running east from the oasis, 3 basins at each end. 18 planting spots ready for seeds he did not have. Soa watched all of this with an expression he could not read. On the 7th night, she sat beside him at the oasis and told him that in her mother's homeland there were plants that grew only in desert sand. Thorn bush with deep taproots that could reach water 10 meters below the surface, salt vine that spread across dunes and held them in place better than any grass, fire lily that bloomed once a year after the hottest day and attracted pollinating beetles from kilometers away. She knew where to find them. Or rather, she knew that her biome already had them somewhere buried under the sand, waiting for the right conditions. Jiwon looked at her. He asked how she knew they were there. She said she could feel them. The desert was hers. The sand spoke to her in small ways, a warmth here, a coolness there. A faint vibration under her feet when something below wanted to surface. He did not question it. In this world, the land was alive. She was part of it. He asked her to walk the whole desert the next day and mark every spot where she felt something underneath. She did. By evening, she had placed 43 small stones across the dune field. He mapped them. The pattern was not random. The buried seeds clustered along a diagonal line running from the southwest corner to the northeast. A buried water channel. An ancient aquifer running beneath the sand that the surface had forgotten about. He knelt at the deepest point of the diagonal and dug with his hands. Half a meter down, the sand turned dark and wet. He kept digging. At 1 meter, water seeped in from the sides. He sat back on his heels and laughed. Soa had just given him an irrigation system that no one had built. It was already there. He just had to find it. Over the next 3 days, he opened the aquifer at 7 points along its length. Small wells, each one he lined with stones and connected to his existing channel system. Water flowed. Not much. A trickle at each point. But a trickle times 7 was enough. The fire lilies surfaced first. Dark red buds pushing through the sand at 3 of Soa's marked spots. Then the salt vine sending pale green runners across the dune nearest to the oasis. The thorn bush took longer, but by the end of the 2nd week, its first gray-green leaves were visible at the southwest edge. The desert was waking up, and on the 14th day, standing at the top of the highest dune, Daewon saw something in the northern mist. A figure walking toward them. Tall, moving slowly through fog that should have been impassable, carrying something heavy on her back. He shaded his eyes and watched. Sowashi came up beside him and followed his gaze. She said that figure was walking on ice. The woman walked out of the mist on a path of frost that formed under her feet and melted behind her. She was tall, almost as tall as Jiwon. Her shoulders were broad, and her posture was the posture of someone who had carried weight for a long time. She wore a heavy gray coat with the fur turned inward, and her hands hung at her sides, scarred and rough. Her hair was the color of iron pulled back tight against her skull. She stopped at the northern edge of the desert where sand met the last wisps of fog and looked at Jiwon with flat, steady eyes. She said her name was Han Ha-un. She said she had been walking for 26 days. She said she would not beg. Jiwon sat down on the sand and gestured for her to sit too. She remained standing. So A brought water from the oasis in the clay pot. Ha-un drank without thanking her, not from rudeness, from exhaustion so deep that courtesy was beyond her reach. Jiwon waited. Ha-an spoke in short sentences, stripped of everything unnecessary. She was from a northern mountain clan called the Hanbong, warriors and hunters. Her family had held an ice domain for 3 generations, glaciers and frozen lakes and pine forests buried in snow 9 months of the year. She had been a shield bearer in her clan's guard since she was 14. 2 years ago, the clan elders decided her glacier was too aggressive. It crept southward every season, freezing the pastures of neighboring lords who complained to the regional council. The elders blamed her bloodline. Her mother had been from a deep frost lineage. The cold in Hyun's veins was too strong, they said. It killed everything around her. They stripped her seal and cast her out on the first day of spring. She walked south. Every domain she approached turned her away. The glacier woman, the one whose love freezes. She said all of this without emotion, as if reading a list of supplies. Jiwon listened. When she finished, he asked her one question. Where do you sleep best? She blinked. No one had asked her that. She said she slept best in small spaces with heavy blankets and the sound of water moving nearby. He nodded. He stood up and walked to the northern edge of his domain where the stone slab met the desert and the mist beyond was thickest and coldest. He stood there for 10 minutes without speaking. So-el watched from a distance. Ha-eun watched too, though she pretended not to. Jiwon was reading the land. The cold air from the north settled into a natural depression just beyond the slab, a shallow bowl in the terrain that the mist filled every night. Cold air is heavy. It flows downhill like water. If Ha-eun placed her glacier here in the northwest, the cold would drain into that bowl and pool there instead of spreading south across the desert. The bowl would become a frost basin, contained, predictable. Everything beyond it would stay warm. He walked back to Ha-eun and told her what he saw. The glacier goes in the northwest. The cold drains into the natural basin. Between the ice and the rest of the domain, he would plant a belt of evergreen shrubs that thrive in cold soil. Their roots would act as a thermal boundary. Their canopy would break the wind. On her glacier itself, he would build a house, not a fortress, a house. Stone walls with double thickness for insulation. A channel cut into the glacier surface to divert meltwater past the foundation, and on the eastern face of the glacier, where volcanic minerals from the deep rock heated groundwater, he would dig until he found a hot spring. Ha-eun stared at him. She asked how he knew there was a hot spring. He said he did not know for certain. But the mist from the north carried a faint sulfur smell that he had noticed on the second day, and the temperature gradient between her frost path and the desert sand was steeper than it should be, which meant geothermal activity somewhere below. He was guessing, but it was an educated guess. Ha-eun was silent for a long time. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a flat stone disc on a leather cord, her seal. She placed it on the slab next to So-e's amber pendant. The ground shook harder this time. From the northwest, a wall of cold swept in, and ice erupted from the mist in a slow, thundering cascade. Glaciers formed in real time, blue-white ice climbing over itself, building ridges and valleys and frozen cliffs. Snow began to fall in a perfect circle, covering the northwest quadrant, while the desert to the south remained untouched. The temperature at the boundary dropped 15 degrees in 20 steps. And there, in the eastern face of the new glacier, Jiwon saw steam, a thin white curl of vapor rising from a crack in the ice. He had been right. He walked to it with Ha-eun following. The crack widened into a narrow crevice, and at the bottom dark water bubbled up from below, hot, almost scalding. He pulled off his shoe and dipped his foot, perfect bathing temperature 1 meter from the source. He looked at Ha-eun. He said he would build a pool here, stone-lined, with a wooden shelter around it so she could sit in hot water and watch the snow fall without the wind reaching her. She would have her small space and her heavy warmth and the sound of water. Ha-eun's jaw tightened. She turned away from him and walked to the edge of the glacier alone. She stood there with her back to everyone for a long time. When she finally came back, her eyes were dry, but the set of her shoulders had changed. Something had loosened. She said 2 words, then build, and he did. It took 11 days. He had no tools except the knife and no materials except stone and ice. But Ha-eun could shape ice with her hands. She pressed her palms against the glacier surface, and the ice obeyed her, moving where she directed. Jiwon drew the plans on flat rock, and she carved them into reality. A rectangular pool 2 meters by 3 cut into the glacier face and fed by the hot spring. Through a channel he angled to control flow rate. A low stone wall around the pool built from rocks, soia carried from the desert where wind erosion had shaped them smooth. A roof of woven thornbush branches that soa cut from the plants, now growing tall enough to harvest. The first building in the domain was a bathhouse. That was not how lords usually began. But Jiwon was not building a lordship. He was building a place where someone could rest. On the evening of the 11th day, Ha-eun lowered herself into the hot water for the first time. Steam rose around her. Snow fell on the thornbush roof and melted into drops that ran down the walls. The water moved with a low, steady murmur. She sat there without moving for an hour. Jiwon left without saying anything, so A met him at the edge of the desert and asked if Ha-eun was all right. He said she would be. The stitch between desert and glacier should not have worked. 15-degree temperature drop across 20 paces. Sand on one side, ice on the other. Any farmer on the continent would have called it a death strip, where nothing could survive. Jiwon called it a transition zone. He spent 3 days walking it, back and forth along the boundary where warm air met cold. He crouched every few meters and held his hand flat above the ground. The soil here was neither frozen nor baked. It was cool and damp. Condensation formed where hot desert air hit the cold front rolling off the glacier. Moisture collected in the thin layer of gravel between the 2 biomes like dew on a glass of cold water in summer. Free irrigation. No channels needed. He pushed his finger into the soil. It went in easily. Dark, rich, full of the mineral dust that Soa's desert wind carried north and the organic matter that Ha-eun's meltwater washed south. 2 biomes that everyone said would destroy each other were feeding a strip of perfect growing soil between them. He marked out a plot. Narrow, 60 meters long and 4 meters wide, running east to west along the full length of the boundary. He cleared stones by hand. He loosened the soil with his knife. Soa helped. Ha-eun helped too, though she said little while working. She was not used to kneeling in dirt. Her hands were made for shields and ice, and she moved with an awkward care that told Jiwon she was afraid of breaking something. He did not comment on it. By the 4th day, the plot was ready. Dark soil turned and smoothed and waiting. He had no seeds. The single sprout from his original clay pot was now a small plant with 4 leaves growing in the basin near the oasis. He still did not know what it was, but it was not food. Not yet. They needed something to eat within 2 weeks, or they would starve. So A's desert had salt vine and fire lilies and thornbush, but none of those were edible. Ha-eun's glacier had ice and rock and hot water, but nothing that grew. The transition zone was perfect soil with nothing in it. Jiwon stood at the edge of the plot and thought about the problem the way he used to think about project sites that had everything except the one thing the client wanted. The land was ready. The water was there. The sun hit this strip for 6 hours a day, filtered through the moisture haze that hung along the boundary. All he needed was seed. On the 5th day, a merchant came. Ji-won heard the cart before he saw it. Wooden wheels on gravel, a donkey braying, a man's voice singing off-key in a language that sounded like the scroll but rougher, older. The merchant appeared from the eastern mist, driving a small cart loaded with sacks and clay jars. He was short and round, with a face burned dark by years of sun and a wide straw hat that had seen better decades. He stopped at the edge of the domain and stared. He stared at the desert to the south. He stared at the glacier to the northwest. He stared at the strip of dark soil between them. Then he stared at Ji-won, who was standing in the middle of the plot with dirt on his knees and a knife in his hand. The merchant said he had been traveling this route for 30 years, and there had never been anything here except fog. Ji-won said, "Things change." The merchant climbed down from his cart and walked closer. He asked what kind of lord builds a bathhouse before a wall. Ji-won said the kind who plans to keep people, not trap them. The merchant laughed. It was a good laugh, surprised and genuine. He said his name was Bae Young-soo, and he was a seed trader from the central market town of Jongwon, 3 days east. He had been selling seeds to lords for 2 decades, and he had never seen a domain like this. He had also never seen a lord with dirt under his fingernails. Ji-won asked what he had for sale. Young-soo opened 3 sacks: barley, radish, cabbage, basic crops. Hardy and fast-growing. The price was 2 copper coins per sack. Ji-won had 3 coins. He bought 1 sack of barley and 1 of radish. He kept the last coin. Young-soo watched him choose and asked why not the cabbage. Ji-won said the cabbage needed more water than he could guarantee right now. Barley was drought-resistant and radish matured in 40 days. He would buy cabbage when he had a second water source. Young-soo tilted his head and looked at Ji-won differently. He asked where Ji-won had learned to farm. Ji-won said he had never farmed a day in his life. He just read a lot. They planted the barley that afternoon. Ji-won spaced the seeds by hand, 4 inches apart, rows running east to west, so every plant got equal light as the sun moved across the southern sky. The radish went in a separate section closer to the glacier side where the soil was cooler and moister. Radishes preferred that, so A scattered the seeds while Ji-won directed spacing. Hyun carried water from the hot spring in a stone basin she had carved from glacier ice that morning. The warm water cooled by the time it reached the plot, settling into the soil at exactly the right temperature, not too cold to shock the seeds, not too warm to cook them. For the first time, the 3 of them worked together on a single task. Nobody spoke much. There was no need. Ji-won pointed, and they understood. By evening, the entire plot was seeded and watered. Young-soo stayed to watch. When they finished, he sat on his cart and shook his head. He said that in 30 years, he had never seen a brand new lord plant his first crop on the same day he bought seed. Most of them spent the first month building walls and hiring guards. Ji-won said walls do not feed people. Young-soo laughed again. He said he would be back in 40 days to see the radishes. Before he left, he reached into his cart and pulled out a small linen pouch. A gift, he said, for the lord who thinks about cabbage water, before he thinks about castle walls. Inside the pouch were seeds, not barley, not radish. Ji-won opened the pouch and held 1 seed up to the fading light. It was round and dark and smelled faintly of something sweet. Young-soo said it was a plum. Takes 3 years to fruit, but worth the wait. Ji-won closed the pouch carefully and put it inside his coat. 3 years. He looked at his domain. Desert and glacier, and a narrow strip of freshly planted soil between them. The pink sky was fading to gray above the glacier and gold above the sand. So-ae sat at the oasis eating a piece of dried thornbush root that she had discovered was barely edible if you boiled it long enough. Ha-yun was already in the hot spring. 3 people, 9 original square meters now grown to a territory he estimated at half a square kilometer. 1 bathhouse, 1 oasis, 43 wells, 1 planted field, 0 walls, and 1 plum seed that would take 3 years. He smiled. He was beginning to think in this world's time scale now. The radishes came up in 32 days. 8 days ahead of schedule. Ji-won pulled the first one from the soil and held it up in the morning light. Fat and red and streaked with white. Heavier than it should have been for its size. The mineral content of the transition zone soil was doing something to the crops, making them denser, richer. He bit into it raw, standing in the field, and the taste hit him so hard he closed his eyes, peppery and sweet at the same time with a crunch that resonated in his jaw. Soe was beside him, and he handed her the second one. She bit into it, and her eyebrows rose. Hayun took the third, without being offered. She ate it in 2 bites and said nothing, but she pulled a fourth from the soil herself, and that was comment enough. And the barley was slower. Pale green shoots stood in neat rows across the eastern half of the plot, swaying in the condensation breeze that moved along the boundary every morning. Jiwan estimated 6 more weeks to harvest. That was fine. The radishes would carry them. He pulled 40 that first morning, enough to last a week if they rationed. He stored them in a pit he had dug at the base of the slab lined with glacier ice to keep them cool. The ice melted slowly in the insulated hole, losing maybe a centimeter a day. A natural refrigerator. Ha-Yun could replenish it in minutes. That same week, Jiwan walked the eastern border of the domain for the first time. He had avoided it until now. The mist there was different from the other directions. Thicker, yellower. It smelled of something dry and old, like chalk dust or bone meal. He stood at the edge where Soa's desert faded into the haze and tried to see through. Nothing. But the sand at the boundary was wrong. It was gray. Not the golden color of Soa's dunes, but a flat, dead gray that crumbled to powder when he pinched it between his fingers. He crouched and looked more closely. The gray sand had no moisture in it at all. No mineral content, no life. It was not sand in any meaningful sense. It was residue. He stood up and stepped back. Soa came up behind him and stopped. She felt it too. She said the desert did not like that side. The sand pulled away from it like skin pulling away from a burn. Jiwon looked at the gray line for a long time. Then he went back to the slab and reread the scroll. He found the passage he was looking for near the bottom. The gray dust. A slow plague of the land moving from the eastern reaches. It turns fertile soil into dead rock. No lord has found a way to stop it. He rolled the scroll up and sat with it in his lap. He had been so focused on building that he had not thought about what was trying to tear it down. The gray dust was not a distant problem. It was right there at his eastern border, close enough to touch. He spent 2 days studying the boundary. The dust advanced slowly, maybe a handwidth per day. At that rate, it would reach the oasis in about a year. The slab in 14 months. He needed a barrier, not a wall. Walls did not stop soil degradation. He knew that from his old life. You cannot block contamination with a fence. You block it with living systems, root networks that filter toxins, bacterial colonies that break down pollutants, plants whose chemistry actively fights the chemistry of the thing that is killing the ground. He did not have any of those yet, but he had an idea. That evening, he sat at the oasis with Soa and Hawon and explained what he had seen. Soa already knew. She said the desert had been whispering about it for days, a wrongness to the east, something eating. Ha'in said she had felt the temperature drop at the eastern edge, not the healthy cold of her glacier, but a dead cold, the cold of something that had stopped living. Jiwon told them he needed to build a buffer zone along the entire eastern border. Living plants with deep roots and aggressive growth patterns, something that could outpace the dust's advance and hold the line while he figured out a permanent solution. The problem was he had nothing to plant there that could survive those conditions. Radishes and barley could not grow in contaminated soil. Thornbush might, but it spread too slowly. Salt vine was a possibility, but it needed moisture and the dust was bone dry. He was still thinking when Soe said something that stopped him. She said that deep in the southwest corner of her desert, where the oldest dunes had been sitting undisturbed since the biome formed, there was a plant she had felt but not seen. Something buried deep, deeper than the thorn bush, deeper than the aquifer. It pulsed like a heartbeat far below the sand. She did not know what it was. Jiwon went with her the next morning. They walked to the southwest corner where the dunes were tallest, and the sand was the color of old gold. Soa knelt and pressed both palms flat against the surface. She closed her eyes. She stayed like that for 5 minutes. Then she pointed straight down. Jiwon dug. He dug for 3 hours, 2 meters down the sand. changed color. 3 meters down, it changed texture. At 4 meters, his knife hit something hard, not stone. Wood. Ancient wood, dry and dense as iron. He cleared around it with his hands and found a root, thick as his forearm, running horizontal through the compacted sand in both directions as far as he could follow it, a root system of something enormous that had grown here long before Soe's biome existed, maybe long before the domain system existed at all. He cut a sliver of the root with his knife. The wood inside was dark red and it smelled like rain, like the first rain after a long drought, the kind that brings everything back. He wrapped the sliver in a piece of linen torn from his sleeve and carried it to the transition zone. He planted it in the easternmost plot, the one closest to the gray dust. Then he watered it with a mix of hot spring water from the glacier and mineral-rich water from the aquifer. And he waited. On the third morning, the sliver had sprouted, a single dark red shoot rising from the soil, growing visibly. By evening, it was a handspan tall with 2 leaves the color of rust. By the second day, it was knee-high with roots already visible at the surface, spreading east toward the dust. Jiwon watched it grow and felt something he had not felt since arriving in this world. Hope, not the cautious practical hope of a planner with a good design. Something rawer. The hope of a man who had been given a ruined lot and found that the ruin itself contained the cure. He took 6 more slivers from the ancient root. He planted them in a line along the eastern border, spaced 10 meters apart. They all sprouted within a day, a red hedge growing toward the gray death. The race had begun. Bae Yongsu returned on the 40th day as promised. He came over the eastern ridge and stopped his cart. He looked at the radish field. He looked at the barley coming in gold and green. He looked at the red hedge growing along the eastern border, its leaves now brushing his waist. He looked at the glacier with steam rising from the bathhouse. He looked at the oasis glowing in the afternoon light. He climbed down from his cart and walked to where Jiwon stood in the field and said that he had been telling people in Gyeongwon about this domain, and nobody believed him. Jiwon asked if that was a problem. Yongsu grinned and said no. He said it was an opportunity. He had brought cabbage seeds this time, and onion, and a proposition. If Jiwon could grow radishes like those in 32 days, Yongsu wanted an exclusive trading contract, first pick of every harvest. Fair prices. In exchange, he would bring anything Jiwon needed from the central markets: tools, cloth, rope, news. Jiwon thought about it for exactly 5 seconds and agreed. Then he asked Yongsu to bring him one more thing next time, a measuring rope, 30 meters long with knots at every meter. He had been estimating distances by pacing for 6 weeks, and it was starting to drive him insane. Yongsu came back 9 days later with the measuring rope. 30 meters of braided hemp with knots dyed red at every meter mark. Jiwon held it in his hands, and for a moment he just stood there, turning the rope over and over. It was the first professional tool he had touched since arriving. The knife was a survival instrument. This was a planning instrument. He spent the entire first day measuring. Everything. The distance from the slab to the oasis. The width of the transition zone at 14 points along its length. The angle of the glacier face relative to true south. The spacing between his red hedge plants along the eastern border. He scratched numbers into a flat stone near the slab, and by evening he had the first accurate survey of his domain. Total area, roughly 600 meters north to south and 400 meters east to west. The glacier occupied the northwest quadrant. The desert filled the south. The transition zone ran between them like a seam. The eastern border was the weakest point. The gray dust had advanced 3 meters since he planted the red hedge. The hedge was growing faster, for now he also measured the things that could not be seen, wind direction at dawn and at dusk, by holding up a wet finger and marking the angle. Temperature differences between biomes by counting how fast ice melted at 10 points across the domain. Sun arc, by driving sticks into the ground at noon and marking shadow length at hourly intervals. By the third day, he had enough data to make his first real plan, not a survival sketch on stone. A plan. He laid the measuring rope out in a long line on the flat sand near the oasis and used smaller ropes to mark a grid. Then he placed stones to represent structures, a small stone for the bathhouse already built, a flat stone for the field, a red pebble for each hedge plant, and then the new things. A long stone where a proper road should run, connecting the oasis to the glacier. A round stone where a cistern should sit to collect condensation from the boundary. 2 flat stones side by side where storage buildings could go, a cluster of pebbles where a market square might stand someday if there were ever enough people to need one. So, I crouched beside him and studied the layout. She asked why the market square was in the center of the domain and not near the road. He explained that markets work best when people have to walk past other things to reach them. You place the market where foot traffic naturally converges. Every path in the domain would eventually cross that point because he was designing the road network to make it so. People would meet without trying. That was how communities formed. She looked at him with an expression he had seen on clients' faces in his old life. The moment when they realized the architect was not decorating their yard, but reshaping how they lived. Ha'an stood at the edge of the glacier and watched them plan. She did not come closer, but she did not leave either. That night, she asked Jiwon a question. She asked whether the house he had mentioned on her glacier was still part of the plan. He said yes. She said nothing else and went to the hot spring. He understood. She was asking without asking, wanting without admitting she wanted. He began the house the next morning. It was not a house by any standard he would have accepted in his old life. It was a single room cut into the glacier face, using Ha'an's ice-shaping ability and lined with stones carried from the desert. The walls were triple-layered, ice on the outside, an air gap in the middle for insulation, stone on the inside to hold warmth. He oriented the single window to face southeast so morning sun would enter and warm the stone interior, while the glacier mass on the north and west sides kept the cold from penetrating. The door was low and narrow, not for defense, but because smaller openings lose less heat. He built a sleeping platform against the south wall, raised 30 centimeters off the floor, so cold air pooling at ground level would pass underneath. A channel cut into the floor carried warm water from the hot spring beneath the platform and out through a drain in the east wall. Heated flooring. The same principle as ondal in Korean houses. Ha-eun watched him work and said nothing for 3 days. On the 4th day, she helped. She shaped ice walls with her hands, pressing and smoothing surfaces that Jiwon marked with charcoal lines. Her precision was extraordinary. She could feel the crystal structure of the ice and adjust it, thinner here for the window frame, thicker there for load-bearing sections, perfectly flat where the stone lining needed a flush surface. On the 7th day, the house was finished. Jiwon stood inside and ran his hand along the wall. The stone was already warm from the hot spring channel running beneath the floor. The air smelled clean and mineral. Light came through the ice ceiling in soft blue waves. It was the most beautiful room he had ever built, and it was 4 meters by 3. Ha-eun stepped inside. She stood in the center and slowly turned in a full circle. Then she sat on the sleeping platform and put her hands flat on the warm stone. She stayed like that for a long time. Jiwon stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him. Soe was waiting. She asked if Ha-eun liked it. He said he thought so. That evening, Yongsoo arrived again with his cart heavier than before. He brought the cabbage seeds and onion seeds as promised. He also brought news, 3 pieces of news and none of them small. First, the Lord of the Eastern River Domain had heard about a strange settlement with 2 climates and sent scouts to investigate. They had been spotted on the road 2 days east. Second, the market town of Jongwon was experiencing its worst trade season in a decade because the gray dust had killed cropland in 2 neighboring domains, and food prices were rising. Third, and Yongsoo said this quietly, there was a woman in Jongwon asking about coastal domains. She claimed to be the last surviving member of the Pak Maritime House. She had a whole bay bound to her seal, and she had nowhere to put it. Jiwon looked at the measuring rope coiled beside the slab. He looked at his stone map with its careful placements. He looked south at the desert and northwest at the glacier and east at the red hedge holding the line against gray death. A bay, salt water, tidal patterns, marine ecology, fish, trade routes, docking infrastructure. He had never designed a harbor in his life, but he had once converted a toxic industrial waterfront into a public beach with a functioning ecosystem. The client had said it was impossible. It took 14 months, and it won a municipal design award. He told Yongsoo to find the woman and tell her there was a lord with a domain that had room for the sea. Yongsoo asked if he was serious. Jiwon said he was always serious about land. Yongsoo left at dawn. The scouts from the Eastern Lord arrived that same afternoon, 2 men in leather armor carrying short swords and a sealed letter. They stood at the edge of the desert and refused to step onto the sand. Jiwon walked out to meet them. The letter was from a lord named Yun Gwansik. The language was formal and the tone was polite, but the content was a threat wrapped in silk. Lord Yun congratulated the holder of the unusual domain on his creative approach to settlement. Lord Yun noted that domains with multiple biomes were historically unstable and often collapsed within the first year. Lord Yun offered his protection and guidance in exchange for a modest tribute of 1/3 of all harvested goods delivered quarterly to his eastern holding. Jiwon read the letter twice. Then he folded it neatly and put it in his coat. He told the scouts to thank Lord Yun for his concern and to tell him that tribute negotiations required a formal survey of both domains' productive capacity, which Jiwon would be happy to discuss after his first full harvest season. The scouts looked at each other. They had expected either submission or anger. They got neither. They got a man who sounded like he was scheduling a meeting. They left. Haeun appeared at Jiwon's shoulder the moment the scouts were out of sight. She said that Yoon Gwansik was not a man who waited for meetings. Jiwon said he knew. That was why he had asked for time. Not to prepare tribute, to prepare the domain. Pak Minju arrived on a Tuesday. Jiwon knew it was a Tuesday because he had started counting days by scratching marks on the copper post, 67 marks since his first morning on the slab. Minju came from the south, walking along the edge of Soa's desert with Yongsu's cart rolling behind her. She was shorter than Jiwon expected, lean and quick-moving, with dark eyes that scanned everything twice before settling. She wore a salt-stained coat that had once been fine. Silver threads still showed at the cuffs, though most of it had frayed. Rack-shell earrings hung from both ears, clicking softly when she turned her head. She stopped at the edge of the domain and looked. She looked for a long time. Desert to the south, glacier to the northwest, green strip between them, with barley standing golden and radishes pushing up in rows. Red hedge along the eastern border, leaves now waist-high and thick, steam from the bathhouse curling into the cold air. She said she had expected a ruin. Jiwon said it had been one. She walked the domain with him for the rest of the day. She asked questions constantly. How deep was the aquifer? What was the soil composition in the transition zone? How fast was the glacier advancing south? Whether the red hedge was self-propagating. How much barley one harvest cycle produced? Jiwon answered every question with numbers. She listened the way merchants listen, weighing each fact against some invisible ledger. By evening, she was sitting at the oasis with her coat off and her sleeves rolled up. She said her name properly then. Pak Minju, last of the Pak Maritime House. Her grandfather had controlled the finest natural harbor on the southern coast. Deep water close to shore, protected by a curved headland that broke storm waves before they reached the docks. 3 generations of shipping wealth, then the gray dust came. It did not kill the sea, but it killed the land around the harbor. The warehouses crumbled, the docks rotted from the landward side. The fresh water sources dried up one by one until the harbor town could not sustain itself. Her family tried to hold on. Her father drowned in a storm trying to repair the outer breakwater alone because there was no crew left. Her mother died of the dust sickness 2 years later. Her brother sailed west and never came back. Minju was the last. She carried the bay in her seal like carrying a coffin. Nobody wanted a harbor attached to a dead coast. Every lord she approached saw the salt water and turned away. Oh, salt kills farmland. Everyone knew that. Jiwon said that everyone was wrong. Saltwater and fresh water can exist in the same system if you manage the interface correctly. He had done it, not with a harbor, but with a wetland restoration project in his old life, where saline groundwater was contaminating a freshwater marsh. The solution was a density gradient. Salt water is heavier than fresh water. If you design the channel correctly, the 2 layers sit on top of each other without mixing. Fresh on top, salt below. 2 complete ecosystems in one body of water, connected but separate. Minju stared at him. She asked if he had done this before. He said once. On paper, it worked in the model. He never got to build it because the client ran out of funding. She asked what happened to the marsh. He said it was probably still dying. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked where her bay would go. He had already thought about it. The east was blocked by the gray dust. The north was glacier. The south was desert that left the southwest. A section of the domain where Soe's desert curved around and the land dipped naturally toward lower ground. If Minju's bay went there, the salt water would fill the natural depression. The curved headland of her harbor would face south, catching the warm wind off the desert, which meant calmer water on the inner side. He would connect the bay to Sowe's oasis with a narrow channel running northeast. Fresh water from the oasis on top. Salt water from the bay below. The channel would create a brackish zone where certain plants and certain fish thrived. Mangrove equivalents, salt-tolerant grasses, shellfish, and the channel mouth, where fresh met salt, would be the most biologically productive strip in the entire domain. Minju listened to all of this without blinking. Then she stood up and unclasped something from around her wrist. A thin bracelet of braided seagrass with a small white shell at the clasp. Her seal, she placed it on the slab. The ground shook. A sound came from the southwest, like a massive door opening underwater. Then the sea arrived. Blue-green water surged into the natural depression, filling it in a slow, rolling wave that climbed the sides of the basin and settled. A curved headland rose from the water, dark basalt, with white spray breaking against its face. The bay formed in the space between headland and shore, deep and calm, the color of jade where the sunlight hit it. Jiwon could smell salt for the first time since arriving in this world. Minju walked to the water's edge and stood there with her bare feet in the surf. Waves lapped at her ankles. She did not cry. She was not the crying kind. But she closed her eyes and breathed and stayed there until the sun went down. The next morning, Jiwon began the channel. This was the hardest engineering he had attempted. The channel needed to be exactly the right width and depth to maintain the density gradient. Too wide and the layers would mix. Too narrow and the flow would be insufficient. He used his measuring rope to mark a path from the bay to the oasis, 210 meters. He calculated the slope. The bay sat roughly 4 meters below the oasis, which meant fresh water would flow downhill naturally. Good. But the salt water could not be allowed to creep uphill. He needed a control point, a sill, a shallow raised section in the channel bed that the heavier salt water could not climb over. He placed it at the 100-meter mark where the terrain had a natural ridge. The channel would be knee-deep before the sill and waist-deep after it. Fresh water would flow over the sill freely. Salt water would pool on the bay side, unable to rise above the ridge. 2 bodies of water sharing one channel without destroying each other. It took 3 weeks to dig. Minju worked harder than anyone. She moved earth with a focus that bordered on fury. Sowa carried sand from the desert to line the channel of banks. Haeun provided ice blocks that they used as temporary dams to control water flow during construction. Jiwon directed every meter of it, measuring, adjusting, recalculating when the soil proved softer than expected in one section and harder in another. On the 22nd day, they removed the last ice dam. Water moved. Fresh water from the oasis flowed smoothly over the sill and down into the bayside of the channel, where it spread across the surface of the saltwater in a thin, shimmering layer. 2 colors, 2 densities, 1 channel. Minju knelt at the sill and put her hand in the water. She pushed down slowly, cool and fresh at the surface. Then her fingers crossed the density boundary and the water became warmer and saltier. She pulled her hand out and looked at Jiwon. She said that in all the years her family had worked the sea, nobody had ever thought of this. He said that was because they were sailors. He was a landscaper. Different tools for the same water. She laughed. It was sharp and short and surprised, the first time he had heard her laugh. The domain had water, fresh and salt and hot. It had sand and ice and a strip of growing soil. It had a bathhouse and an ice house and an oasis and a bay. What it did not have was enough food to last the winter. The barley harvest came in on day 89. Jiwon cut the stalks with his knife one by one because he had no scythe. So-ah and Ha-un and Minju worked beside him, 4 people cutting barley with knives in a field the width of a road. It took 2 full days. The yield was better than he expected. The mineral-rich soil had produced grain heads twice the normal size, dense and heavy. When he threshed them by hand on a flat stone, the kernels poured out golden and fat. He weighed the total harvest by filling sacks and comparing them to the measuring rope's known weight per meter. Rough math, enough barley to feed 4 people for 3 months if supplemented with radishes and whatever fish Minju could catch in the bay. Winter was 5 months away. He needed to double his cropland or find another food source, or both. He chose both. The next 3 weeks were the busiest since he arrived. He extended the transition zone field westward by 20 meters, clearing a new section of boundary soil and planting cabbage and onion from Yongsu's seeds. He built a fish trap in the bay, using woven thornbush branches staked into the shallows where Minju said the current pushed bait fish against the shore. The trap filled overnight silver fish the length of his hand. Minju cleaned them with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times before. They smoked the fish over a fire pit that Hayun insulated with an ice-walled chimney, designed to pull the smoke upward and away from the living areas. Jiwon had not designed a chimney before, but the principle was the same as any ventilation system. Hot air rises, give it a path, and it follows. Yongsu came twice during this period. The first time he brought rope and cloth and a small iron cooking pot that cost the last copper coin. The second time he brought information. The scouts had returned to Gwansik with Jiwon's message about the formal survey. Gwansik had not responded. That was worse than a response. It meant he was deciding. And a man like Gwansik did not take long to decide. Yongsu also brought word about the domain's growing reputation. Merchants in Zhongwon were talking about the Lord with 3 climates. 2 traveling scholars had written about it in letters sent to the central academies. A cartographer had added the domain to his working maps, though he could not figure out how to draw it. 3 climates in 1 territory broke every mapping convention he knew. And there was a woman, Yongsu said this carefully, a young woman in the Western Hill Country, a herbalist, widow of a minor lord's son. She had been cast out by her husband's family after his death, because her blood was common and her biome was farmland. Simple farmland. Wheat and buckwheat and flax. The noble family considered it beneath them. She was living in a roadside shelter making poultices for travelers and slowly starving. Her name was Cho Ye Rim. Jiwan asked what kind of farmland. Yong-su described it. Flat, rich soil, deep topsoil, natural drainage. The kind of land that grew anything you put in it without complaint. The kind of land that made farming look easy. Jiwon sat on the slab and thought he had a desert, a glacier, a bay. His transition zone was productive, but narrow. He needed a proper agricultural base, something that could feed not 4 people, but 40. Because 40 was coming. He could feel it in the way Yongsu talked about the merchants and the scholars and the cartographers that people were noticing. People would come, and people needed to eat. He told Yongsu to find Cho Yerim and bring her. 3 days later, she arrived. She came on foot carrying a cloth bundle and a wooden box. The bundle held her clothes. The box held seeds, dozens of small linen pouches, each labeled in a careful hand with the name of a plant and the season it should be sown. She was small and quiet, with dirt permanently embedded under her fingernails and in the creases of her knuckles. Her face was round and her eyes were steady. She did not look like someone who had been starving. She looked like someone who had been waiting. Jaewon met her at the southern edge of the domain. She looked at the desert and the glacier and the bay and the red hedge and the barley field, and she did not say anything for a long time. Then she opened her wooden box and held up a seed pouch. She said this was winter wheat. It needed cold nights and warm days and mineral soil and consistent moisture. She asked if he had all 4. He pointed to the transition zone. Cold air from the glacier at night, desert heat reflected off the sand during the day, mineral-rich boundary soil, condensation moisture every morning. She looked where he pointed. Then she looked at him. She asked who taught him to read land like that. He said nobody taught him. He went to school for 7 years and then worked for 6 more. And everything he learned was about looking at a place and understanding what it wanted to become. She nodded as if that was a perfectly normal answer. She asked where her biome would go. He walked her to the space between the transition zone and Minju's Bay, a gentle slope facing south with good drainage and protection from the glacier wind provided by the natural ridge where the channel sill sat. Her farmland would fill the heart of the domain, the center, where everything else connected. She took off a thin cord from her wrist with a clay bead the color of dark earth. She placed it on the slab. The ground trembled, and from the center of the domain soil erupted, not violently, gently. Like bread rising. Dark, rich earth spreading outward in a wave, pushing the sand and gravel aside. and settling into the depression between the other biomes. Flat and warm and smelling of rain and growing things. Within minutes, a perfect agricultural plain stretched across the center of the territory, So'e's desert to the south, Ha'un's glacier to the northwest, Minju's bay to the southwest. And now, Yerim's fields in the middle, binding it all together. Jiwon stood at the edge of the new soil and knelt. He pushed his hand in to the wrist. Warm, loose, the kind of topsoil that took nature 1,000 years to build. He pulled his hand out and looked at Yerim. She was already kneeling beside him, opening her box. She pulled out pouch after pouch, winter wheat, buckwheat, flax, radish varieties he had never seen, herbs with names she spoke like friends, yarrow, mugwort, shepherd's purse, comfrey. Each one she held up and told him what it did. This one heals cuts. This one settles stomachs. This one keeps insects away from the wheat if you plant it at the border. This one fixes nitrogen in the soil so the wheat grows stronger. Jiwon sat beside her and listened. He pulled out a flat stone and his knife, and he wrote down everything she said. Every plant name, every property, every companion relationship. Which grew best next to which could not tolerate which needed shade and which needed full sun, and which did not care. She talked for 3 hours, he wrote for 3 hours. When she stopped, he had the most detailed planting guide he had seen in either world. She looked at his stone covered in scratched notes, and her lip trembled. She asked why he was writing it down. He said, because it mattered. She said nobody had ever thought so before. He said that was their mistake, not hers. She turned away and wiped her face with her sleeve. Then she stood up and asked where they should start planting. They planted for 6 days straight. Yerim directed and Jiwon measured. Every row spaced precisely. Wheat in the center of the field, buckwheat in a ring around it, flax on the south side, where it got the most light, herbs along every border, acting as natural pest barriers and soil enrichers. It was the most sophisticated planting scheme anyone on the continent had ever seen, and it was designed by a woman everyone had called a peasant and a man everyone thought was a fool on a rock. Our day 140. The domain had a shape now. Jiwon stood on the slab at dawn and turned in a slow circle. South, the golden dunes of So'e's desert shimmering in early light with the oasis glittering at its eastern edge and the date palm grove casting long shadows westward. Northwest, the blue-white wall of Ha'un's glacier with steam from the hot spring rising into the cold air and the ice house glowing faintly in the morning. Southwest, the dark jade water of Minju's bay with the headland standing like a sentinel and the channel glinting where it ran northeast toward the oasis. And in the center, Yerim's fields. Green. Impossibly green. Winter wheat already ankle-high in neat rows with buckwheat just breaking the surface, and flax standing pale and straight along the southern border. The herbs were filling in, yarrow and mugwort and shepherd's purse forming low dense hedges between crop sections exactly as Yerim had planned. The domain was half a kilometer across in every direction. 5 people lived in it, and it was not enough. Not because the land was lacking, because the land needed hands. Jiwon had calculated it during a sleepless night the week before. His field plan required 8 people minimum to maintain during growing season, planting and weeding and watering and harvesting across 4 biomes with different schedules and different needs. He had 4 wives and himself. 5. And winter was 3 months away, which meant the winter wheat needed tending through cold, and the fish traps needed checking daily, and the red hedge along the eastern border needed monitoring because the gray dust had not stopped. It had slowed. The hedge was holding, but holding was not winning. The hedge needed reinforcement, and the reinforcement needed labor, and labor needed food, and food needed labor. The circle closed on itself. He needed people. The first ones came without being invited. A family of 5, father and mother and 3 children. They appeared at the northern edge of the domain on a cold morning, walking out of the mist with everything they owned on a wooden sled. Their clothes were gray, not from dye, from dust. The father's name was Doksu. He said they had walked for 19 days from a domain to the northeast that had been swallowed by the gray dust. Their lord had fled. The fields were dead. The well had turned to powder. They had nothing. Jiwon gave them radishes and smoked fish and hot water from the spring. Then he sat with Doksu and asked him what he could do. Doksu said he was a thatcher. He could build roofs from any material, reed or straw or brush or bark. Give him a frame, and he would keep the rain out. Jiwon looked at the domain and saw roofs. The ice house had a thorn bush canopy. The storage pit by the slab had no cover at all. The fish smoking station needed a permanent shelter. Minju had been talking about a drying rack for the bay that needed wind protection overhead. He told Doksu he had work for a year. Doksu's wife wept, not from sadness. The second group came a week later. 8 people, former servants of a lord whose domain had collapsed after a failed war with a neighbor. They had no skills except farming and carrying and building walls from mud brick. Jiwon put them to work on the fields under Yerim's direction. She taught them her planting system in 3 days. They learned fast because they were hungry, and hungry people do not waste lessons. By the end of the month, 31 people lived in the domain. Jiwon had not planned for 31. He had planned for maybe 10 by the end of the first year. The gray dust was pushing people out of their homes faster than anyone had predicted, and his domain was the nearest functioning territory on the eastern frontier. He adapted. He always adapted. That was the job. He redesigned the field layout to accommodate more workers. He expanded the fish trap system to 3 traps staggered along the bay shore. He dug 2 new wells along the aquifer line that So-A had mapped. He built a communal kitchen near the center of the fields using a design he remembered from a disaster relief camp he had visited once in his old life. Simple, efficient. 1 fire pit serving 20 people. Yerim ran the kitchen. She was good at feeding crowds. Her herbs turned simple barley porridge into something people asked for seconds of. Minju organized the fishing crews. 3 boats built from thornbush wood and sealed with pine resin that Ha-un supplied from a stand of frozen conifers on the glacier's western slope. The boats were crude. They floated. That was enough. Ha-un did something nobody expected. She started training. 3 of the refugees were young men who had served as guards in their former domain. They knew basic sword work, but nothing about fighting on ice or in cold conditions. Ha-un took them to the glacier every morning. She ran them through drills on the frozen surface where footing was treacherous and every movement had to be deliberate. She did not explain why. She did not need to. Everyone knew Gwansik was coming. Jiwon spent his evenings on the slab. It was still the highest point in the domain, and from there he could see everything. He sat on the edge with his legs hanging over and his measuring rope coiled beside him, and he planned not just the domain, the defense. He had never designed a fortification, but he had designed landscapes that controlled movement, parks where foot traffic was funneled through specific corridors by the placement of hedges and water features and elevation changes. A battlefield was the same thing, a landscape where you controlled where people could walk. He studied the domain's terrain with new eyes. The glacier was impassable from the north. No army would cross that ice without Ha-un's permission. The desert was open from the south, but the dunes were soft and deep, and cavalry would founder in them within 100 meters. That left 2 approaches, the east through the gray dust zone where the red hedge grew, and the west where the land was still open mist and flat ground. The west was the weak point. Jiwon marked it on his stone map. He needed something there, a biome, a barrier, something. On day 158, a woman walked out of the western mist. She was tall, broad-shouldered. Her forearms were dark with old burns that ran from wrist to elbow in overlapping patterns like the rings of a tree. She carried an anvil on her back, not a small one, a full smithing anvil that must have weighed 40 kilograms. She walked with it like it was a sack of flour. She set it down at the western edge of the domain and straightened up and looked at Jiwon, who was standing in the field with dirt on his knees and a measuring rope in his hand. She said her name was Ko Saran. She said she was a blacksmith. She said her clan had thrown her out because a woman at the forge was a disgrace. She said she did not care about their opinions, but she did care about having a forge because without one, she was nothing. Then she looked at the domain, at the desert and the glacier and the bay and the fields, at the 31 people moving between them, working and eating and building. She said this was the strangest thing she had ever seen. Jiwon said he got that a lot. He asked her what she needed. She said fire and metal and stone. He asked her to show him how she worked. Oh, she looked at him strangely. He explained. He could not build her a forge until he understood her body mechanics, where she stood relative to the anvil, how high the forge needed to be for her reach, whether she struck left-handed or right-handed, what angle she held the hammer at the peak of her swing. The distance between her stance and the quench barrel. Saran stared at him for a long time. Then she set up her anvil on flat ground and pulled a hammer from her pack and began to work a piece of scrap iron she carried. Ji-won stood to the side and watched for an hour. He did not speak. He watched her feet, her shoulders, the arc of her hammer, the way she shifted weight between strikes, the angle of her wrist at the moment of impact, the distance she stepped back to examine her work. He measured the height of the anvil relative to her hip, the reach of her arm at full extension, the width of her stance. When she finished, he had a forge plan scratched on stone. Anvil height adjusted 2 inches higher than standard for her longer arms. Forge mouth oriented to her left because she was right-handed, and the natural workflow moved left to right. Quench barrel at 45 degrees behind her right hip within arm's reach without turning. Bellows on a raised platform so she could pump without bending. Tool rack at eye level on the left wall. Every dimension fitted to her body. He showed her the plan. She looked at it and her jaw tightened and her eyes went bright and she turned away. When she turned back, she was holding a flat stone disc. Her seal. She put it on the slab without ceremony. The ground shook harder than it ever had. From the west, rock erupted. Not flat farmland or rolling dunes or frozen cliffs. Sharp stone. Dark granite ridges veined with ore that glittered copper and iron and something darker that might have been tin. A mountain plateau rising from the mist and joining the western edge of the domain like a fist clenching. The sound of stone settling echoed for minutes. When it stopped, the domain had walls. Not built walls, mountain walls, and somewhere inside that stone was everything Saran would ever need. Saran built the forge in 4 days. She worked from Ji-won's plan, but she improved it as she went. The chimney he had sketched as a simple vertical shaft, she curved into a spiral that drew air more efficiently and kept sparks from landing on the roof. The quench barrel he had placed behind her right hip, she doubled. 1 for water, 1 for oil. Different metals needed different cooling, and she was not going to walk across the room every time she switched. Ji-won watched the changes and noted them. He had designed for her body. She was designing for her craft. Together, the forge was better than either of them could have made alone. The first thing she made was nails. 200 iron nails in 2 days. Simple, uniform, sharp. Ji-won almost wept when he held the first batch. Nails meant joinery. Joinery meant real structures, not ice-cut rooms or sandbanked shelters or thornbush canopies, buildings, walls that did not melt, roofs that did not blow away, doors that locked. He set Doksu and his thatching crew to work immediately. A proper storehouse first. Timber was the problem. The domain had no forest. Ha'eun's glacier had frozen pines, but they were brittle. So Ae's desert had nothing taller than a thorn bush. Minju's bay had driftwood that washed in with the tide, but never enough and never straight. Saren's mountain had stone, but stone alone made cold buildings. They needed wood. Ji-won solved it the way he solved everything, by looking at what he had and seeing what it could become. The thorn bush in Soe's desert had grown aggressively since the aquifer opened. Some of the oldest plants now had trunks thick as a man's forearm and wood dense enough to ring when struck. Not ideal lumber, but usable. He sent a crew of 6 into the desert to harvest thornbush trunks under Soa's guidance. She knew which plants could be cut without weakening the root network and which were anchoring dunes that would shift without them. They brought back 40 trunks in 3 days. Saran examined one and said the wood was terrible for burning but excellent for building. Too dense to rot quickly, too hard for insects to bore. She heated nails until they glowed and drove them through the thornbush wood without splitting. Good enough. The storehouse went up in 8 days. Stone foundation from Saran's mountain. Thornbush frame held with iron nails. Thatched roof from Doksu's crew using dried flax straw from Yerim's harvest. It was 6 meters by 4 with a raised floor to keep moisture out and ventilation gaps at the top of each wall for airflow. Ji-won oriented it with the long axis running east-west. so the narrow ends faced the prevailing wind and the broad sides caught afternoon shade from the mountain. Inside, they stored barley and dried fish and smoked radishes and salt that Minju scraped from rocks in the bay. The first proper building in the domain that was not a house or a bathhouse. A building for everyone. The population hit 42 that month. Word was spreading faster than Jiwan could manage. 3 more refugee families from dust-dead domains. A pair of brothers who were carpenters and had heard about the lord who used nails. An old woman who wove cloth and wanted flax. A former fisherman from a coastal domain that had dried up. Each one brought hands and mouths. Each one needed a place to sleep and a task to do and a reason to stay. Jiwan spent an entire night redesigning the domain layout. The original stone map beside the slab was too small. He laid out a new one on a flat section of Yerim's field using stakes and rope. The domain was roughly circular now. Glacier in the northwest, mountain in the west, desert in the south, bay in the southwest, fields in the center, the slab at the heart. He marked zones. Agricultural zone, covering the fields and the transition strip. Industrial zone, on the mountain slope near the forge. Residential zone between the fields and the glacier where the ground was firm and the temperature was moderate. Market zone at the center where all paths crossed. Harbor zone at the bay, each zone connected by paths that he laid out, following natural terrain contours so water would drain off them rather than pooling. The paths were not straight. They curved, because curved paths slow people down, and slowing people down means they look around, and looking around means they notice their neighbors. And noticing neighbors is how a settlement becomes a community. He had learned that from a professor in his second year of university. He had never thought he would apply it to a fantasy kingdom. Minju was the first to notice what he was doing. She walked the new path from the bay to the market zone and stopped halfway. She turned around and looked back at the bay. Then she looked forward at the fields. Then she looked at Jiwon. She said that the curve in the path framed the view of the bay perfectly. From this exact spot, you could see the headland and the water and the boats and the smoke from the fish drying station all at once, and in the other direction, the fields stretched green to the glacier. It was beautiful. He said it was not about beauty. It was about sight lines. If people at the market could see the harbor, they would think about trade. If fishermen walking home could see the fields, they would think about dinner. Visual connection created mental connection, created economic connection. She said that was the most romantic thing a man had ever said to her and then walked away laughing. He was not sure if she was joking. On day 170, Yong-soo arrived with the largest cart Jiwon had seen him drive. 2 donkeys instead of Fidida 1. The cart was loaded with goods, cloth, rope, 3 iron tools, salt, dried meat, cooking oil, and a letter. The letter was not from Gwansik. It was from Jongwon's town council. They had heard about the domain with 5 climates. They had heard about the crops that grew twice the size. They had heard about the fish and the ice and the nails and the herbs. They wanted to establish a formal trade route. A road, maintained by both parties, with tariff agreements and seasonal market days and mutual defense provisions. Jiwon read the letter and set it down. A trade route meant legitimacy. It meant his domain was no longer an oddity or a rumor. It was a place on the map that other places wanted to connect to. It also meant a road, a physical path from Jongwon to his eastern border, through the zone where the gray dust crept and the red hedge fought. Anyone traveling that road would see the dust, would know how close it was, would understand what Jiwon was holding back. He agreed to the trade route. He sent terms with Yong-soo, fair tariffs, shared road maintenance, market days on the 1st and 15th of each month, and one additional clause. Any traveler on the road who saw the gray dust advance past the red hedge was to send word immediately to both the domain and Jongwon. Shared early warning. Because the dust was not just his problem, it was everyone's. The council agreed within a week. The road crew arrived 2 weeks later, 12 workers with tools and carts. They cut a path from the eastern border to the market zone in 6 days. Jiwon supervised the route. It passed through the transition zone, where workers could see the crops growing impossibly well between desert and glacier. It curved past the storehouse where they could smell smoked fish and dried herbs. It ended at the market zone where Saran had set up a display of ironwork and Minju had laid out salted fish and Yerim had arranged baskets of radishes and early cabbage. The first market day drew 19 visitors from Jongwon. They came on foot and by cart. They bought everything. Every radish, every fish, every nail. The iron nails sold for 10 times what Saran expected. Nobody on the continent had seen nails this uniform. Machine-like precision, she called it, though there were no machines. Just a smith working from an architect's measurements in a forge built to fit her body. The visitors left with empty purses and full carts and stories they would tell for months. The domain was real, it was growing, and somewhere to the east, Yoon Gwan-sik was listening to those same stories and grinding his teeth down to the roots. Gwan-sik's first move was quiet. A trader arrived at the market on the third market day. He was not from Jongwon. He wore clothes too fine for a road merchant, and his hands were too soft for a man who loaded his own cart. He bought nothing. He walked every path. He counted buildings. He watched Ha-un's trainees drill on the glacier from a distance. He asked the refugee families where they had come from and how many more were on the road. He left before sundown. Minju spotted him first. She told Jiwon that evening, sitting at the channel sill where fresh water ran over salt. She said the man was a surveyor. She had seen them before in her father's harbor. Men who walked a place and memorized it so that others could plan without ever visiting. Jiwon was not surprised. He had been expecting it since the scouts. He asked Minju how long between a survey and an attack in her experience. She said it depended on the lord. A cautious lord waited a season. A proud lord waited a month. A desperate lord did not wait at all. Gwan-sik was proud. Jiwon called everyone together that night. All 47 residents gathered in the market zone around a fire pit that Yerim had built for cooking. He did not make a speech. He explained, a powerful lord to the east considered their domain a threat. That lord had resources and soldiers and experience. He would come. Not today, maybe not this month, but he would come. And when he came, the domain needed to be ready. Not with an army. They did not have one and would not have one in time. With the land itself. He had been thinking about this since the first scouts arrived. The domain was not a castle. It could not be walled and garrisoned. It was a landscape, and landscapes could be shaped to control movement the way a riverbed controls water. He spent the next 3 weeks rebuilding the domain's edges, not with walls, with terrain. The eastern approach was already protected by the red hedge, which had grown into a dense barrier taller than a man with thorns the length of a finger. Behind the hedge, he dug a series of shallow channels connected to the aquifer that turned the ground into soft mud after a heavy watering. Any force pushing through the hedge would hit wet ground that grabbed at boots and wheels. The southern desert was already difficult for organized movement. He made it worse. He asked SOA to shift the dunes along the southeastern border into a pattern that created natural funnels, wide openings that narrowed to choke points. An army entering the desert would spread out across the wide sections and then compress into the narrows where they would be slow and disorganized. The western mountain needed no modification. Saran's plateau was a natural fortress. Sheer rock on 3 sides with only 2 passes wide enough for a cart. Jiwon narrowed both passes by encouraging thornbush growth along their edges. An army trying to come through the mountain would march single file through thorns with cliffs on either side. The northern glacier was Ha-un's domain. Absolutely, she could reshape the ice at will. She created crevices along the approach routes, covered them with thin ice bridges that looked solid, but would break under the weight of a man in armor. She marked each one with a small stone, visible only to people who knew to look. Her trainees memorized every marker. That left the northeast, the gap between the glacier and the red hedge where the terrain was flat and open, the most obvious route for an attacking force. Jiwon studied it for 3 days. Then he asked Minju to help him. He needed water. Not much, just enough to turn that flat ground into something else. They extended a secondary channel from the bay running northeast along the inside of the domain's border. The channel was shallow and wide, and it leaked deliberately. Water seeped into the flat ground and over 2 weeks transformed it from firm earth into a marshy bog. Not deep enough to drown in, just deep enough to sink in up to the knee. Jiwan planted saltgrass from the bay's edge throughout the marsh. The grass held the water, and within a month, the bog looked like a meadow. Green and flat and inviting. A perfect killing ground for anyone who did not know the water was there. He hated that phrase, killing ground. He was a landscape architect. He built parks and gardens and waterfronts. He restored damaged ecosystems and designed spaces where people could sit and think and breathe. Now he was turning those same skills toward making a place where people would fall and drown and die. He sat on the slab that evening and stared at his hands. Soe brought him tea. She sat beside him and did not speak. After a long time, he said that he had spent his whole career making places better for people to live in. She said he was still doing that. He was making this place safe for the people who lived in it. That was the same thing. He wanted to believe her. Ha-Un appeared at the edge of the slab. She had been watching from the glacier. She said that in her clan, they had a saying. The shield is not ashamed of the sword. It exists because the sword exists. The wall does not choose to be a wall. It chooses to protect what is behind it. He looked at her. She held his gaze with those flat, steady eyes, and for the first time he saw something behind them that was not distance. It was certainty. She was certain about him. She did not need him to be comfortable with it yet. She just needed him to finish. He finished. By the end of the third week, the domain was ringed with designed obstacles that looked like natural terrain. Bog in the northeast, desert funnels in the south, mountain passes in the west, like glacier traps in the north, red hedge and mud in the east. No walls, no towers, no moats. Just landscape, shaped by a man who understood that the most powerful barrier is one that the enemy does not recognize as a barrier until they are already inside it. On day 192, Yongsu arrived at a gallop. His donkey was foaming. He had left Zhongwon before dawn. Guansik had mobilized 300 soldiers, 50 cavalry, supply wagons for a 2-week campaign. They were on the road heading west. Yongsu estimated 4 days' march. Jiwan thanked him. He walked to the center of the domain. He stood in Yerim's field among the winter wheat that was now knee-high and golden green. He could see every biome from here. Desert, glacier, bay, mountain, fields, his home. He had 192 days on this land. He had 6 biomes and 47 people and 0 soldiers. And a professional eye that could read terrain better than any general who had ever lived on this continent. He went to work. 4 days. Jiwan divided them like project phases. Day 1 was positioning. He walked the domain with each wife separately. Soe would hold the southeastern desert. Her job was not to fight. Her job was to let the desert fight. She would shift the dunes to close the funnels behind any force that entered. Sand behind them. Sand ahead. No retreat, no advance. Jiwan showed her the 3 choke points he had designed, and she memorized them without him asking twice. Ha-Un would hold the north. Her glacier, her rules. She would stand at the highest point of the ice field and watch the crevasse bridges. When soldiers stepped on them, she would shatter the ice beneath. She would not do it immediately. She would wait until the maximum number of men were on the bridges. Timing was everything. She nodded once and walked to her glacier without another word. Minju would hold the bay and the channel system. If the enemy tried to flank from the southwest, she would open the channel sluices and flood the low ground between the bay and the fields. Controlled flooding, ankle-deep water across a 100-meter front, not enough to drown, enough to slow a charge to a stumble. Seiran would hold the mountain passes. She had spent the last week forging spearheads, 60 of them. Simple, leaf-shaped points on the thornbush shafts. She armed the 3 trained guards and 9 of the strongest refugees, 12 fighters for 2 passes. She would stand at the western pass herself with her forge hammer. Yerim would hold the center, not with weapons, with logistics. She organized the non-fighters into supply teams, water carriers, bandage rollers using linen strips torn from flax cloth, food prepared in advance. 40 loaves of barley bread and 3 barrels of smoked fish, enough to last 3 days if it came to that. Jiwan would hold nowhere and everywhere. He would stand on the slab at the center of the domain and watch. He had a system of signal flags made from dyed cloth, red for danger, blue for hold, green for advance, white for retreat. Each wife knew her colors. Each knew to look at the slab when the signal changed. Day 2 was preparation. Jiwan walked every defensive position one more time. He adjusted the marsh in the northeast too firm in one section, he opened a secondary water feed and softened it. He checked the desert funnels with So-A. The third choke point was too wide. She shifted a dune 30 meters east and narrowed it. He checked the glacier traps with Ha-Yun. 2 of the ice bridges were too obviously thin. She added a layer of frost on top to match the surrounding surface. He checked the mountain passes. Ran had laid caltrops, small iron stars with 4 points that she had hammered out that morning, scattered across both passes and covered with a thin layer of gravel. He had not asked for caltrops. She had made them because she was Ran, and when she saw a problem, she hit it with a hammer. Day 3 was rest. Ji-won ordered everyone to sleep. Half the domain ignored him. Ha-Yun ran her trainees through one more drill. Saran sharpened spearheads by lantern light. Minju checked the channel sluices 3 times. So-E sat in her desert and listened to the sand. Rim baked bread. Ji-won sat on the slab and did not sleep either. He looked at the stars. This world's sky was different from Seoul's. More stars, brighter. The pink tinge of this world's atmosphere colored the constellations in faint rose and copper. He thought about the file on his laptop, the unfinished plan for the client who wanted her property to save someone. He had not thought about it in weeks. He thought about it now. 6 women, each one given a place designed for her, each one building something from what had been discarded. He was doing the same thing again, the same project on a different scale. The thought sat heavy in his chest. He let it sit. Day 4. Dawn. The scouts came running. Gwansyk's army was visible on the eastern horizon. A column of dust rising from the road. 300 soldiers, 50 cavalry. Supply wagons in the rear. Banners in red and gold. Gwansyk himself rode at the front on a gray horse. The army stopped half a kilometer from the eastern border. They formed ranks in the open ground beyond the red hedge. Cavalry on the flanks. Infantry in the center, wagons pulled into a defensive square behind the lines. Professional, organized, overwhelming. Gwansyk rode forward alone. He stopped at the edge of the red hedge and called out. He addressed the Lord of the Stone Slab. He said that this farce had gone on long enough. He said that a man who collected broken women and planted radishes was not a lord. He said he offered one final chance. Surrender the domain. Keep the women. Leave with whatever could be carried. Ji-won stood on the slab 600 meters away. He could hear Gwansyk's voice carried on the desert wind. He raised the blue flag, hold, then he raised the green flag. Saran would have understood, but the green was not for Saran. It was for So-A. So-A closed the desert behind Gwansyk's cavalry. The southeastern funnels had been left open all morning. 50 horsemen saw the wide, sandy approach and charged. They poured through the first gap and the second gap, and then So-A moved the dunes. Sand rose behind the cavalry like a door swinging shut. The third funnel narrowed to nothing. The horsemen were in a sand bowl 200 meters wide with rising dunes on every side. Their horses sank to the fetlock. They milled in circles. Useless. Gwansyk turned and saw his cavalry vanish into the desert. His face went dark. He ordered the infantry forward. 300 men marching in formation toward the red hedge. They hit the hedge and pushed through. The thorns tore at their armor and their skin, but they were disciplined and they kept moving. They came out the other side into the mud, the soft, wet ground that Ji-won had prepared with aquifer water. Boots sank. Formation broke. Men stumbled into each other. Officers shouted to keep ranks, but you cannot keep ranks when the ground is pulling at your feet. 100 soldiers pushed through the mud toward the northeast approach, the flat green meadow that looked so inviting. They hit the bog at a run. The salt grass held their weight for 1 step, 2 steps. On the third, the ground opened and men went down to the knee. To the hip, shields dropped, spears fell. The charge became a crawl. The remaining soldiers tried the northern route around the glacier. Ha-Eun was waiting. They found what looked like solid ice and marched onto it. 20 men. 30, 40. Ha-Eun watched from her perch and counted. When 52 men were on the ice bridges, she pressed her palms flat against the glacier surface. The bridges shattered, not all at once, in sequence. Starting from the back, so the men in front heard the screams behind them and turned and saw nothing but open crevasses where their companions had been. Most survived the fall. The crevasses were deep but not bottomless, and Ha-yun had shaped the bottoms smooth so men would slide rather than break. But they could not climb out, not in armor, not on ice. They sat in blue darkness and waited for the battle to be over. Gwansik sent his last reserve toward the mountain passes. 60 men who had held back now rushed west. They hit Saran's caltrops in the first pass. Iron points punched through boot leather, and men fell screaming. The second pass was clear of caltrops. They poured through. Saran was standing at the end of it. Behind her stood 12 fighters with thornbush spears. The pass was 3 meters wide. Saran filled 2 of those meters by herself. She held her forge hammer in both hands. The first soldier came through the pass at a run, and Saran swung the hammer once. He went backward into the men behind him. The second soldier tried to go around her. The pass was not wide enough. The third soldier stopped. The men behind him stopped. Saran stood there breathing evenly and waiting. Nobody came through. The battle lasted 38 minutes. When it was over, Gwansik sat on his horse in front of the red hedge with no cavalry and no infantry and no reserve. His supply wagons stood untouched in their defensive square, staffed by cooks and grooms who had not signed up for this. He looked at the domain, at the desert that had swallowed his horsemen, at the bog that had swallowed his infantry, at the glacier that had swallowed his flankers, at the mountain pass where a woman with a hammer stood between him and everything he wanted. Jiwon walked out to the hedge. He stood on his side of the thorns and looked at Gwansik. He did not gloat. He said that the soldiers in the crevasses would be pulled out within the hour. The men in the sand bowl would be released when the cavalry horses were unsaddled and disarmed. The wounded from the bog and the passes would be treated by his herbalist, who was already preparing bandages. And then Gwansik would leave. Gwansik said nothing. He turned his horse and rode east. His cooks and grooms followed with the wagons. The battle was over. Jiwon had not raised a weapon. He had raised the land. The weeks after the battle were strange, quiet in a way the domain had not been quiet before. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something settling into place. The refugee families who had flinched at every loud noise now walked the paths without looking over their shoulders. The fighters who had held the passes with Saran went back to farming and fishing and thatching as if they had not stood in a gap with spears 2 weeks ago. Jiwon spent the first 3 days after the battle undoing what he had built. He drained the bog. He reconnected the water feeds to the normal irrigation channels. He asked So-ei to smooth the desert funnels back into open dunes. He told Ha-yun to repair the glacier bridges, not because he thought the danger was over, because the domain was not a fortress. It was a home, and homes should not feel like traps even to the people who lived in them. The defenses could be rebuilt in days if needed. The feeling of safety took longer. On the 4th day after the battle, a woman walked in from the east. She did not come through the red hedge. She came along the new trade road from Jongwon, walking in the exact center of the path as if the road itself had invited her. She was slender and moved with an odd lightness, like someone who was listening to something nobody else could hear. Her hair was long and unbound, and it floated behind her in a wind that did not seem to touch the grass on either side of the road. She wore a white robe, simple, unadorned, the kind of robe Jiwon had seen in paintings of temple priestesses. She stopped at the market zone and stood there, looking around with wide, dark eyes. Yerim was the first to approach her. Yerim asked if she was lost. The woman said she was not lost. She said she was looking for the place where the spirit still spoke. Yerim brought her to Jiwon. He was in the fields measuring the winter wheat, which was now waist-high and 3 weeks from harvest. The woman stood at the edge of the field and looked at him and then past him and then at something he could not see. She said her name was Shin Yuna. She was the last priestess of the Fading Grove, a temple in the eastern mountains where spirits had gathered for centuries. The spirits had been leaving for 20 years, one by one, the oldest first, then the younger ones, then even the newborn spirits that formed in spring puddles and autumn leaves. The grove was empty now, a dead place. She had stayed until the last spirit left, and then she walked west because something pulled her. Not a voice, a feeling, like standing at the edge of a slope and sensing which way water would run. She had followed that feeling for 31 days, and it had brought her here. Jiwon asked her what she needed. She said she needed a grove, a place where the conditions were right for spirits to return. Not a temple, not a shrine, a living place with the right light and the right moisture and the right silence. Spirits were not supernatural in the way Jiwon had first assumed. They were part of the ecology. They formed where certain conditions overlapped. Old trees, clean water, undisturbed soils, specific frequencies of wind through specific leaf shapes. A grove was not a building. It was an ecosystem tuned to a particular resonance. Jiwon understood, not the mystical part, the ecological part. He had designed sensory gardens in his old life, spaces where the combination of plants and water features and wind patterns created specific experiences. A meditation garden where the sound of bamboo rustling was calibrated to a frequency that lowered heart rate. A hospital courtyard where the arrangement of flowering trees produced a sequence of scents through the seasons that patients described as comforting. If spirits were drawn to specific environmental conditions, then designing a grove was not magic. It was landscape architecture for a client he could not see. He spent 2 days with Yuna walking the domain. He asked her to point at every place where she felt even a faint trace of spiritual presence. She pointed at the oasis, at the hot spring, at the oldest thorn bush in the desert, at the place where the channel sill separated fresh and salt water, at the plum sapling that Jiwon had planted from Yongsu's gift, now chest high, and putting out its first branches. Every place she pointed was a place where two systems met. Water and sand, heat and cold, fresh and salt, growth and stone, transitions, edges. The places between things. Spirits lived in the margins. Jiwon designed the grove in one night. He placed it on the eastern side of the domain between the red hedge and Yerim's fields. The location was deliberate. It was the edge where life met death, where the domain's fertility pressed against the gray dust's sterility, the ultimate transition zone. He planned a circular clearing 40 meters across. In the center, a spring-fed pool connected to the aquifer. Around the pool, 3 rings of trees. Inner ring of date palms from Soa's desert. Middle ring of frozen pines transplanted from Hasyun's glacier, packed with soil from Yerim's fields to keep the roots alive in the warmer ground. Outer ring of thornbush, left to grow wild and thick, forming a natural wall of sound-dampening foliage. Between the rings, he planted Yuna's specifications. Mosses she named that grew on the north side of certain stones, ferns that unfurled only at dusk, a ground cover plant with leaves shaped to catch and hold dew, until mid-morning, creating tiny prisms of light at ground level. The water in the central pool he connected to both the fresh system and the salt system through 2 separate underground feeds meeting at the pool's bottom, brackish water, neither one thing nor the other. The ultimate margin. Yuna placed her seal on the slab, a smooth riverstone threaded on a silk cord. The grove erupted from the eastern soil in a slow green wave. Trees rose fully formed but young. Moss covered the stones overnight. The pool filled clear and still, and on the first morning when dawnlight filtered through the palm fronds and caught the dew on the ground cover and turned the grove into a constellation of tiny lights, something moved in the water. A ripple with no wind, a shimmer at the edge of sight. Yuna knelt at the pool's edge and pressed her forehead to the ground. When she lifted her face, she was smiling. They had come back. Not many. 3, maybe 4. Small presences no larger than a hand, hovering at the margin where the water touched the moss. Testing the air. Deciding. But they were there. For the first time in 20 years, spirits had returned to the eastern reaches of the continent, and they had returned to a grove, designed by a man who did not believe in spirits, but believed absolutely in the conditions that produced them. The news spread faster than anything before. Yongsu did not need to carry it. The spirits carried it themselves. Within a week, every domain within traveling distance knew that the spirits spoke again in the east. Scholars came, priestesses from other dying temples, a delegation from the Central Academy who stayed 3 days and left with 17 pages of notes. And one more visitor, a messenger from the heavenly court, the first in 20 years. He arrived on the trade road wearing a robe of deep blue with silver thread at the hem. He walked into the domain without stopping at the border. He walked past the market zone and the storehouse and the fields. He walked to the slab at the center and stood there, waiting. Ji-won came to meet him. The messenger said that the court had been watching. He said that the court was ready to speak, and he said that what the court wished to say concerned the stone beneath Ji-won's feet. The messenger's name was irrelevant. He said so himself. He was a voice, not a person. The court spoke through him, and when the message was delivered, he would walk back into the mist and be no one again. He stood on the slab and placed his palm on the copper post. The seal carved into the metal began to glow, not brightly. A deep amber warmth that spread through the stone beneath their feet and hummed at a frequency Ji-won felt in his teeth. The messenger spoke. 23 years ago, the heavenly court had fractured. Not politically, physically. The great seal that bound the continent's 12 domains into a single living system had cracked. The seal was not a symbol. It was an anchor, a piece of worked stone set into the foundation of the world that regulated the flow of energy between biomes. When the seal cracked, the energy stopped flowing. Domains that had once exchanged warmth and cold and water and minerals through deep underground channels became isolated. Each biome turned inward, feeding only itself. The spirits who lived in the margins between biomes lost their habitat. The connections that sustained them disappeared. They faded. The gray dust was not a plague. It was a symptom. When biomes stopped exchanging energy with each other, the soil at their borders died. The death spread inward, slowly eating the margins first and then the centers. Every domain on the continent was dying, some faster than others. The rich ones fastest because they had the most to lose and no way to replace it. The stone slab was the broken seal, not a piece of it. The whole thing, compressed and dormant, waiting for someone who could do what the seal once did. Connect things that were separate. Build transitions between incompatible systems. Read the land and understand where energy needed to flow. The court had not chosen Ji-won randomly. They had watched him in his old world. They had seen him kneel in toxic soil and find the path back to life. They had seen him sit with a client for 3 hours listening to how she woke up and where she liked to sit in the evening and whether she was afraid of water. They had seen him draw plans that turned dead spaces into living ones. They had waited 23 years for someone like him. And when he died on a road outside Fikyeon with an unfinished file on his laptop, they took him. The messenger removed his hand from the post. The glow faded. He looked at Ji-won with eyes that were very old and a face that was very young. He said the court was not asking Ji-won to rule. The court was asking him to do what he had already been doing. But bigger, Ji-won stood on the slab, his slab, the 9 square meters of stone where he had woken up 197 days ago with nothing but a seed and a knife. He looked at the domain around him. 6 biomes, stitched together with channels and groves and fields and paths designed to make incompatible things coexist. A desert that fed a glacier that fed a bay that fed the fields that fed the people who fed the spirits who held the land together. A circle, a system, the thing he had been building his entire professional life in 2 separate worlds. He asked the messenger one question. He asked what happened to the file. The messenger did not understand. Ji-won said there was a plan on his laptop, a plan for a woman who asked him to make her property save someone after she was gone. He needed to know if someone finished it. The messenger was silent for a long time. Then he said that the file had been found. A colleague in Ji-won's studio had opened it. She had finished the plan. The property was now a community garden in a neighborhood that had not had green space in 40 years. Children played there. Old people sat on benches under the trees that Ji-won had specified in his planting schedule. The woman's house was gone, but the garden remained. It was saving people every day. Ji-won sat down on the edge of the slab. He sat there for a long time. Soa found him later. She sat beside him without speaking. Then Ha-eun came and stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder. Minju climbed onto the slab and sat cross-legged facing him. Yerim brought tea. Saran leaned against the copper post with her arms crossed. Yuna stood at the edge of the slab and listened to whatever she always listened to. None of them asked what the messenger had said. They did not need to. They had all felt the slab hum. They all knew their biomes were pieces of something larger. They had known since the first channel connected the first two systems. They had been waiting for him to know it too. Jiwon drank the tea. Yerim had made it from dried chamomile and mint from her herb garden. It was warm and slightly bitter, and it tasted like a place where someone had thought carefully about what to grow and where to grow it, and who would drink it on a cold evening. He looked at his wives, 6 women, each one carrying a wound that matched a landscape. Parchedness and isolation and cold and loss and rejection and fading. He had not healed them. He had given them ground to stand on, and they had healed themselves. That was the job. That had always been the job. He set the cup down. He said he would do it. But he had conditions. First, he would not leave the domain. The work would be done from here. Outward, the way roots spread from a single tree. Second, his wives would lead the expansion. Each one understood her biome better than he ever could. He would design. They would build. Third, the people of the domain would choose, not be commanded. Every refugee and farmer and fisherman and thatcher would be asked whether they wanted to be part of this, and anyone who said no would be free to stay as they were. The messenger nodded. He said the court accepted. Then he turned and walked back down the trade road and into the eastern mist and was gone. Jiwon sat on the slab until the stars came out. The domain hummed beneath him, not the amber glow of the seal, something quieter. The sound of 6 biomes breathing together through the channels and groves and paths he had drawn into the earth with a dull knife on his first morning. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since arriving in this world, he let himself feel the full weight of what he had been given. Not a kingdom, a project. The biggest reclamation project in the history of 2 worlds. He opened his eyes, he pulled out his measuring rope, and he started planning. Spring came to the domain on day 221. Jiwon knew because Yerim's cherry tree bloomed. The plum sapling that Yongsu had given him was still a year from flowering, but the cherry that Yerim had planted from her own stalk opened its first blossoms on a cool morning when the mist was thin and the light was gold. 5 pale petals on a single branch. Yerim saw it first. She stood in the field with her hands covered in soil and looked at the blossom and did not move for a long time. Jaewon was measuring the eastern border when he heard her call. He walked over and stood beside her and looked at the flower. It was small and perfect, and it had no business blooming this early in a place where desert heat met glacier cold. But the transition zone did not follow normal rules. It followed the rules Jiwon had built for it. The microclimate was precisely calibrated. Night cold from the glacier triggered dormancy. Day warmth from the desert triggered growth. The oscillation created a growing season that was technically impossible, but functionally real. The cherry did not care about what was technically impossible. It cared about temperature and light and water, and all 3 were right, so it bloomed. Jiwon touched the petal with one finger, soft, thin enough to see light through. He let his hand drop and looked east. The gray dust had not advanced in 40 days. The red hedge held the line. But more than the hedge, something else was happening at the border. The grove that Yuna had planted was spreading. Not the trees, the condition, the marginal state where 2 systems met and produced something neither could produce alone. Spirits had been gathering in the grove for weeks. Not 3 or 4 now, dozens, small and large. Some visible as shimmers of light, some felt only as warmth on the skin or a sound at the edge of hearing. Yuna said they were rebuilding, reconnecting pathways that had been severed when the seal cracked. Underground channels of energy that once linked every biome on the continent were slowly reopening, starting from the grove, spreading east. The dust retreated where the energy returned, not dramatically, not in a wave of green reclaiming gray, slowly, a centimeter a day, grass appearing where dead powder had been, moisture returning to soil that had been dry for years, small things. But small things measured over months became kilometers. Jiwon had designed the grove as a habitat for spirits. It turned out he had designed a beachhead, the first point of reconnection in a continental network that had been dark for 23 years, and it worked because it sat on the broken seal. The slab beneath his feet was amplifying the grove's effect, pushing the reconnection further and faster than any natural process could. He had not planned that. He had planned a garden. The garden was doing something larger on its own. That was the thing about landscapes. You designed the conditions. Nature did the rest. The winter wheat harvest came on day 230, the largest harvest the domain had ever seen. Enough grain to feed 70 people for 6 months. They had 73 people now. Close enough. The surplus radishes and cabbage and fish and herbs filled the storehouse to the ceiling. Saran's forge produced iron tools that Yongsu sold in Zhongwon for prices that made other smiths travel to the domain just to see how she worked. Minju's fishing crews brought in catches that exceeded demand. She started salting and barreling the excess for export. Ha-Yun's glacier provided ice that was cut into blocks and sold to merchants who used it to preserve food on long trade routes. The ice trade alone brought in more revenue than most small domains produced in a year. The domain was prosperous, but prosperity was not the point. The point was the people. Jiwan walked the paths every morning, the curved paths he had designed to slow people down and make them look around. He saw what he had hoped to see. A thatcher's daughter learning herb medicine from Yerim, a former soldier from the glacier training helping Minju repair fishing nets because he had grown up near water and missed it. 2 refugee children playing at the edge of the grove, watched by a spirit that hovered above them like a luminous moth. An old carpenter teaching Seiran's apprentice how to fit thornbush joints without nails while Seiran stood behind them pretending not to learn the same lesson. A community. Not because he had decreed it, because the paths made people meet and meeting made people talk, and talking made people help. The domain was a machine for producing connection. He had designed it that way, but watching it work still surprised him. On day 250, Yongsu brought news for the last time. He sat in the market zone with a cup of Yerim's chamomile tea and told Juwon that Guansik was dead. The gray dust had taken his eastern domain, the rich river, the 3 cities, the gold mines, all of it gray and dead. Guansik had refused to leave. He stood in his great hall as the walls crumbled to powder around him and the dust filled his lungs. His servants fled. His soldiers scattered. He died alone in a ruin that had been the finest domain on the continent 6 months ago. Jiwan was silent for a long time. He had not liked Guansik. He had feared him. He had prepared to fight him, and he had beaten him. But he had not wanted this. Nobody deserved to die, watching everything they built turn to dust. He asked Yongsu if there were survivors from Guansik's domain. Yongsu said hundreds, scattered on the roads, heading west, heading toward the only place on the continent where the dust did not reach. Juan looked at his domain. 73 people, a storehouse full of food, 6 biomes, and a grove and a seal that was slowly healing the continent 1 centimeter at a day. He looked at his measuring rope coiled on the slab. He looked at the cherry blossom still holding its petals in the transition zone breeze. He told Youngsu to spread the word. The domain was open. Anyone who came would be fed and housed and given work. There would be no tests, no blood requirements, no questions about what biome they carried or what family had thrown them away. The only requirement was willingness to build. Yongsu asked how many people the domain could hold. Jiwon said he did not know yet. He would figure it out. That was what he did. The morning of day 260 was pink, the same pink as his first morning on the slab, rose gold light bleeding across a sky that was not his, but had become his. Jiwon sat on the edge of the slab with his legs hanging over the side. There was no void below him now. Below him, Yerim's wheat grew in the field he had measured and planted and harvested. Beyond the wheat, So-Ah's desert glowed amber in the dawn. Beyond the desert, Minju's Bay caught the first light on its surface and turned it to scattered silver. To the northwest, Ha-Yun's glacier reflected pink sky in blue ice. To the west, Saran's mountain stood dark and solid with smoke already rising from the forge. To the east, Yuna's grove hummed with a quiet life that Jiwon could not hear but could feel in the soles of his feet. The heavenly court seal pulsed beneath him, slow and steady, a heartbeat. So-Ah brought him tea. She set the cup beside him on the stone and sat down at his left side. She did not speak. She did not need to. She had been the first, the girl with the desert that burned everything. She placed her hand on the stone between them, and he could feel the warmth of her biome in her skin. Ha-Yun came next. She stood behind him and put her hand on his shoulder. Her palm was cool. It was always cool. He had stopped noticing. Minju climbed onto the slab and sat cross-legged across from him, grinning. Her shell earrings clicked. She said something about the fishing being excellent today and laughed at her own observation. Yerim knelt at the edge of the field, just below the slab. Her hands were already in the soil. She held up a handful of dark earth and showed him a new sprout she had found. Something she had not planted, something the land had produced on its own. Seiran's hammer rang from the mountain. 1 strike, 2, 3, a rhythm that carried across the entire domain like a second heartbeat laid over the pulse of the seal. Even from here, Jiwon could picture her, arms dark with old burns, stance wide. The forge he had built to fit her body, producing something useful with every swing. Yuna stood at the grove's edge, facing east. The spirits moved around her, more every day. She turned and looked back at Jiwon across the full length of the domain, and he could not see her expression at that distance, but he knew she was smiling. She had told him once that he was the thing that held everything together. He had not understood at the time. He understood now, not because he was powerful, not because he was chosen, because he looked at broken things and saw where the pieces fit. A messenger arrived on the trade road, another one from the heavenly court, formal robes, silver thread. He carried a scroll sealed with the court's mark. Jiwon knew what it contained, the invitation to become one of the 12, to take his place among the lords who shaped the continent, to step off the slab and into a title that would make him one of the most powerful men in the world. He looked at the messenger. He looked at the scroll. He looked at Soa's tea steaming beside him on the stone. He said he would accept, but first, he would finish his tea. One of his wives had spent half the morning making it. The messenger blinked. Jiwon picked up the cup. He drank. The tea was warm and bitter and sweet, and it tasted like chamomile that grew in soil between a desert and a glacier in a place that should not exist but did because someone had sat down with a dull knife and scratched a plane into stone on a morning just like this one. He set the cup down. He swung his legs one more time over the edge of the slab. Below him, a world he had built from 9 square meters of rock and a single seed. He stood up. He rolled out his measuring rope. And he got back to work.